This is Behind the Headlines, with behind-the-scenes analysis on issues affecting Pennsylvanians, sponsored by the Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy. Now, here's your host.
Hi, from Pittsburgh to Scranton and Philadelphia to Erie, it's Behind the Headlines. I'm Charlie Greenawalt, Senior Fellow at the Susquehanna Valley Center, and I'm joined as usual by my co-host Mara Donnelly. Hi, Mara.
Hello, Charlie.
Mara, I have to ask you, it's all over Harrisburg.
Yes?
Have you been verbally abused or assaulted by the Lieutenant Governor recently?
Oh, boy, Charlie. No, I can honestly say I've never met the man. Never met him.
You've never met Senator
Never been in his
Lieutenant Governor Stack?
Never been in his company. So it's safe to say that no, none of those things have occurred. So
well, it's.
I think I'm very fortunate.
Certainly there's no end of things to talk about in Harrisburg.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah. Well, one last piece of gossip here. Did
Yes.
you remember Senator Jubileer just celebrated his 80th birthday?
Yeah.
And in sort of celebration of that, he was reelected to the Penn State Board of Trustees.
Oh,
so
that's nice.
Congratulations to Senator Jubileer.
I worked in the Senate when he was in there, so.
Yep. And he was the best person I ever worked for.
Nice man.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, and he did a lot in education, and that's what we're here to talk about today.
Oh, great.
We're fortunate enough to have with us today two Marks. We are fortunate enough today to have with us Mark Price of the Keystone Research Center and Mark Steer of the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center. Let's start out with you, Mr. Price. You are the primary author of a brand new report that's come out, and it's essentially a cost-benefit analysis of higher education in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Is that a fair depiction?
It is. First, thank you for having me on. It is what it is an examination of something that I think parents have long known when they're sending their kids to college, that this is a chance for their kids to have more opportunity than they had growing up. And what we did is take a look at some new data that was released in January that very precisely asked the question, what share of kids enrolled in higher education in Pennsylvania at various institutions come from working and middle-class families. We're talking families making a little less than $73,500 a year. And in particular, what's really unique about this data is that it allows us to ask the question, not only what was their family income before they went to college, but what happened to those kids once they became adults.
Because you went back pretty far.
That's right. We looked at kids who went to college here in Pennsylvania in the late 90s and early 2000s. And then the study checks up on them when they were in their early 30s. And again, ask the question, well, where are your earnings? Where do you rank relative to your peers?
Hopefully gainfully employed.
Exactly. Hopefully gainfully employed, as all parents wish.
Yeah.
And one of the things that sort of came out of this look is we found that what won't be a surprise, I think, to a lot of people is that the state system of higher education, the 14 schools in the state system, actually performs better than really most of the other schools in the state in both enrolling kids from that bottom 60% and then catapulting them up as adults into the top 40%. And they actually have a larger share of students than, say, elite colleges like the University of Pennsylvania or Bucknell. And that really comes down to just simply the greater access, which again is the story that we understand about the state system. It's a system that provides affordable access to the opportunity that higher education provides. So that's really the good news that we found in the report.
Well, going to Mark Steer for a second, this goes back some of the problems that we have with finances and funding, which is being debated what the next year's higher education budget will be on Capitol Hill right now. But we find that this goes back to Governor Corbett's time in office. Now, I think Governor Corbett did a yeoman's job with many things, with the exception of taking some very, I thought, bad advice from some of his advisors on funding for the state system. Because if you want to develop an area economically, one of the real launching pads is education. That you generally want to make sure you have the best educational system possible. And Governor Corbett then ended up having a series of cuts in the state funding for higher education, didn't they?
Yes, we've had cuts actually from before Governor Corbett as well, although there was a huge cut in his term. You know, we talk about the budget deficit a lot in this state. I think we don't always realize that we also have a public investment deficit, and that's most clearly seen in the case of higher education. Between 2001 and 2014, we've cut state funding by 32% in this state. And on the other side, we've increased tuition 48%. Mark's report shows how much the state system means to giving kids an opportunity to rise from working in middle-class backgrounds to upper middle-class backgrounds and even above it by getting the education that really is the promise of the American dream. You know, central to this country has always been, if you work hard, you'll get an opportunity to get ahead. We were the first country in the world to provide K-12 education universally. We were the first country in the world to increase access to higher education. State university systems like the PASHE system have been absolutely critical to that. This report shows it's still critical in Pennsylvania. But the fact that we're cutting funding means that we're not providing the same kind of access. And the recent data we have about who is attending these schools suggests that we are really cutting off access to a lot of people who could benefit from getting a good education at these schools.
So the result of decreased funding, increased tuition, is a reduction in the number of students that are going to these universities.
We do observe a decline in the share of students from working families in the state system. And to be clear, it's a decline across all colleges and universities, and it's been less severe in the state system, but it's down by about 15%. And the real concern, right, is that these are engines of upward mobility, and what we have here is a clear example of access to that being reduced because tuition's rising very fast, something that's being necessitated by cuts in state funding. On top of that, we also have a concern now that the chancellors of the state system have suggested that they're considering either layoffs or closure of 5 of the state system schools, Cheney, California, Clarion. And when we looked at these schools in this data, they stand out even among the state system as being schools that serve low-income communities in rural places and in urban communities, but also enroll a much larger share of kids from this bottom 60%. So we're very concerned that sort of the trend here is a reduced access, and now we're even in discussions because of the challenges of the state budget. We're in discussions of even reducing that access further.
Wow.
Going back to Mark Steer for a moment, you had said that there was about a 1/3 reduction in spending here in Pennsylvania for higher education over the last several gubernatorial administrations. Is that seen also in other states across the union, or do we stand out like a sore thumb in that regard?
I think the answer is depends. And some states have done that. Some states have done less. And there's really been a problem with higher education costs going up and state budgets being tight pretty much all over the country. But states have responded very differently. And I think in general what you find is the states that have responded by sustaining their public investment, not just in higher education but across the board, have seen their economies grow faster, while the states that have embraced austerity in higher education and other areas have seen tax revenues keep falling and falling because they're undermining their own economic growth. We talked a moment about opportunity for people in the working class and lower middle class to rise. This also creates an opportunity for economies. One of the things we know about modern economic life is that you need an educated workforce in order to attract job growth, business investment. If we're not educating our kids at the same level we had been in the past, we will see our economy suffer. And that you can certainly see in the data across from one state to another.
How has this report been received? I realize it's only been out for a couple of weeks, but what's been the reaction to it?
I think it's been well received. I think some of it, I think people had a sense for. Certainly, there has long been an understanding that the state system and public schools in general have done a better job providing access to working families. Mm-hmm. So in many respects, this sort of confirms.
A surprise.
Yeah, it wasn't a surprise.
Okay.
I think what was more of a surprise and much more interesting is just the greater success and potential of pushing more kids into this top 40%. In the public schools in general, but also in the state system, than in schools like Bucknell and University of Pennsylvania, which are exceptional schools and do a great job, but the state schools are actually punching above their weight in that respect, pushing more kids into the top 40% than even those schools. And again, it just comes back to access.
Mr. Price, could you tell us how have you gone about getting the results of your study out to the general public so that it has a chance to sink in the public consciousness?
Sure. So we've released the report. It's available on our website for the Keystone Research Center and the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center. We have put out an op-ed, appeared in the Patriot News. We'll put out op-eds across the rest of the state. We're appearing here. Hopefully this will help encourage people to spread the word. And so far the feedback's been very positive.
So there's one aspect of the report that might be giving people a little bit of indigestion. I know you look surprised, but it's the whole how are we going to pay for this thing? So can you tell us a little bit about, there's a tax increase proposal in there. Tell us a little bit about how that would be structured and what the plan is, because I think you gave a full report because you not only pointed out the data, but you also make some recommendations or suggestions on how we can fix this.
Sure.
So
I think the most important thing to recognize is that the Independent Fiscal Office is projecting that this Commonwealth as a whole is going to be facing deficits in the order of $2 billion each year over the next 5 years. And that creates a very difficult environment in order to generate new revenues to key priorities. It's hard to find new revenue for basic education, hard to find new revenue for higher ed. So in that environment, it's not going to be possible to make meaningful investments in any priority area. So you've got to recommend, or at least we've recommended, some ways to consider raising some additional revenue. In the report, we suggested you could raise roughly $2 billion. You could devote some of that to higher ed, some of it to basic education, through a higher tax on capital gains and dividends, and lowering the tax on wages. We think this is a particularly appealing way to raise money in this respect because what we are talking about is investing in higher education, which is actually what it's doing is taking low and middle income kids and propelling them into the top. And what we're suggesting here is that we raise taxes on the highest earners in the Commonwealth and ask them to pay a little bit more for what really is a good cause, which is generating more opportunity for middle-class kids.
how has that been received?
As you can imagine, it's never an easy conversation to
Right.
talk about raising revenue.
Absolutely, yeah. So that's probably your biggest challenge.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
For both of you, I mean, there seems to be a surprise among some academic administrators and some state policymakers that we've been raising tuition consistently to make up for this reduction in state aid to higher education, and now all of a sudden there's a surprise on the part of some that we have fewer students applying for our universities because of the enrollments. Can you talk about that relationship between tuition level and applications for the universities?
Yeah, I think it's clear in looking at this data that it is a very destructive cycle, actually, that the state system finds itself trapped in. Tuition is rising, and that's making it harder for kids to be able to afford. And certainly a lot of kids in the recent decades we've heard a lot about, right, as tuition's been rising, state support's been falling, the kids have been falling back on student loan debt. But even that has an upper limit, right? Especially for working families who just, they're not going to be able to raise enough money that way even to fund some of these tuition bills. So that certainly is reducing enrollment, we think, in the state system. It's reducing the enrollment of kids from working families. And now on top of that, you do actually hear some voices talking about, well, if enrollment's falling, maybe we should cut back state support even further, right? And so we're discussing closing campuses. It's sort of compounding the problem that these institutions face.
Wow.
It seems that we're going to have you come back because this conversation is going to continue.
And there are going to be more reports coming out. So
Exactly.
That's a reason to have them back.
But the status of some of these, at least 5 of the 14 of the state universities, is somewhat in abeyance, and we just don't know what's going to happen and what happens to all the areas where they're located and the economies of those areas. So we absolutely need to have you back, Mr. Price and Mr. Steer. We really appreciate you being here today. We'll be back with segment 2 right after this. Stay tuned.
Behind the Headlines is brought to you as a public service by the Hospital and Health System Association of Pennsylvania, helping hospitals provide healing, health, and hope to communities across the state. And by the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry. The Pennsylvania Chamber serves as the frontline advocate for business on Pennsylvania's Capitol Hill by by influencing the legislative, regulatory, and judicial branches of state government. Additional underwriting provided by the Worrell Corporation Foundation, based in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, by the Edward H. and Jeannie Arnold Foundation, and by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business. Behind the Headlines is also supported as a public service by the Pennsylvania Highway Information Association, the go-to source to learn about transportation projects and issues. Visit pahighwayinfo.org.
Hi, welcome back to the second segment of Behind the Headlines. In this segment, Mara and I are joined by a friend of Behind the Headlines, one of the most trusted and one of the most veteran reporters on state government. That's Tony Romeo
Here's
from
the $20 I owe you.
from KYW and KDKA. Tony, you have been around state government for decades, and if anyone knows what's going on in Harrisburg, I think you do.
Well, maybe one of the folks who knows what's going on, yeah.
And therefore, Mara and I would like to ask you today about this situation that keeps on getting closer and closer for Pennsylvania residents, and the state doesn't seem to be responding, and that is our licenses, our driver's licenses, are not up to snuff according to the federal government. No Pennsylvanians will be able to use it, to use our driver licenses as ID to fly or to go into any federal facilities in the near future. Thank goodness Mara and I have passports. Yeah. Do you have your passport?
I do, yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about this? What's going on?
Well, I don't know that the state is not being responsive so much as it is in keeping with the motto of the Pennsylvania legislature, which is never do today what you can put off until tomorrow. It seems like nothing important gets done in the Pennsylvania legislature unless there's a deadline, and I mean a deadline like do this now.
What's the crux of the problem here?
With Real ID?
Yeah.
Well, what Real ID was is there was resistance to cooperating when it was launched years ago by the federal government, and Pennsylvania actually passed a law. The legislature, with broad support, passed, and the governor signed a bill for forbidding PennDOT from cooperating with the mandates of Real ID.
Why?
I think there were concerns about cost, and I think also privacy issues.
Okay.
You know, the idea of creating a database on people. But the bottom line is that law has been in place ever since, and Pennsylvania is already on an extension of the mandate, of compliance with the mandate. But the way things stand now, as of early June, your Pennsylvania driver's license, which is not compliant with Real ID, will no longer be accepted as ID to get into nuclear plants and many federal facilities, including military bases. Then in January, if your ID is not compliant with Real ID in January of 2018, then you won't be able to fly. Your driver's license will not be acceptable as ID to fly. So what has happened is that some time ago, earlier this year, the state Senate passed a bill that would repeal that law that said you can't cooperate or you can't take steps to comply with Real ID. And then last week, the House took that bill, and of course, as they would want to do, they amended it, which means now, of course, you have the House and Senate are not in agreement on what they're going to do about that. The clock is ticking because obviously you have this sort of de facto deadline of June 6th. But one thing to keep in mind is that even if they do something by June 6th, it's going to take a while for licenses to become compliant. Now, PennDOT has Pennsylvania driver's licenses are already compliant in many ways, but there's still more that needs to be done, and it won't happen right away. But I think the belief is on Capitol Hill here in Harrisburg is that if the legislature and the governor repeal the law banning cooperation, then the feds will grant another extension. But again, the problem is that the House amended the bill last week, essentially to create an opt-out for people.
So you could get a standard license, or you could choose to get the real
Right.
ID.
You have the,
What-
I imagine
what is
the
the
Real ID
difference?
would be the standard license,
Oh,
and you could
okay.
opt out for one that
And
isn't.
get a regular one, which means you have no plans to fly or to
Well,
go
or
into
you have
federal buildings.
other identification like a passport, or a
passport,
military
okay.
ID that would be acceptable.
What's the difference between the real ID and our what part of are we
I'm-
not
yeah,
compliant with?
There are many aspects to this,
Aspects,
but
okay.
I think for one thing, I think that there's some sort of
Watermark
verbiage or
thing,
watermark
yeah, okay.
or image on the driver's license that's required. Again, I think there's issues regarding personal information,
Okay.
and so the House version of the bill would create an option for people to say, I don't want to be a part of that. I don't want a license that has that stuff on it.
Okay.
And then they would know, of course, that their license wouldn't be valid to get on an airplane. But the bottom line is that they're not in session this week, and as we sit here and record this, and they only have, I think, 5 session days before the
So they are under the gun.
de facto
literally.
deadline. and now the House Majority Leader Dave Reed was up on Capitol Hill, and again about a week or so before we were here today, and told us that not to worry, that he believes that the House and Senate will come to some sort of an agreement. But the governor has indicated that he has concerns about the amendments that were put in by the House. So,
Tony, this
So
reminds
stay tuned.
this reminds me of the motor voter situation some years ago, where we were the last state in the union to approve of the motor voter law, if I remember correctly, and we were pulled into it kicking and screaming, and the only reason why we signed on was we wanted our federal transportation funding.
yeah, well, right, and obviously there has to be, this is just my observation covering the legislature for years, there just has to be some sort of deadline that has serious consequences for them to do something. Now, yeah, the only exception to that when it comes to sea change legislation, I mean, things are really big. The only exception to that I can think of in recent years is medical marijuana, which they actually passed in March, I think, and the governor signed in April of last year. But otherwise, pretty much the really, really important things that you care about all end up getting done when they're up against some sort of a deadline, which is either if we don't do this, then there are consequences, or we're going away for the summer for a couple of months, and we have to do this budget thing, and that's generally what just seems to happen.
Well, you said it, budget.
Yeah.
What's
What's
going to happen? with
Well,
the
that's
budget this
that's
year?
another example of what we're talking about. Again, when Leader Reed was up talking with reporters, he sort of hinted at the idea that he might be a little frustrated that they really haven't made much progress as
That's why
we
it's
sit
been
here.
so quiet. There doesn't seem to be a lot of discussion, budget discussion.
Well, and that's just
Yeah.
how they roll here. I mean, I just I even posed the question to him. Are you frustrated that when it comes to the budget, nobody gets serious about it until the last 2 weeks of June, and maybe even not then.
Yeah. Sometimes not.
And he had pointed out the fact that the House passed its version of a budget in April, and that he had hoped that would jumpstart the conversations earlier. But as of the time he spoke with us, that really hadn't happened, at least not serious negotiations.
Are there any big issues they're going to tackle in this budget season?
Well, if issues, by
Pension,
issues, well, I mean, there's always a desire on the part of leadership to get pensions done, but forgive me, I don't want to alienate people, but to me that's one of those things where unless somebody is standing there saying that if you don't pass this bill tomorrow, the state's going to be bankrupt, that's one of those things that
They
put
off.
I have a just as an aside, I've been joking with people. I have an ill kitty cat that I have to medicate every day, and my joke is the only thing harder than getting 102 votes in the House for pension reform is getting a pill into a cat. And that's the problem. I mean, one thing is that our the House of Representatives is big, and there's actually legislation that would have a referendum, which is a part of the process of a constitutional amendment to reduce the size of the state house. But you have to get 102 votes for anything to pass in the House, and that's.
Well, this is news to our viewers. So you're saying that you don't see pension reform.
I just don't.
Pension reform on the horizon.
I just don't, because it's been on the horizon for years. And it's been it was a key part. It was the key reason, essentially, that the budget deal they had in December of 2015 collapsed. You remember that basically that year we went out without a budget, and they were in mid to late December, and they had this deal, and it involved pension reform, but they just couldn't get the votes for it in the House. So that's the cynic in me, I guess, saying I just don't see that coming together. Maybe I'll be, surprised, but I'm just basing my evaluation of that on what I know of how these things have gone in the past.
So I don't know any other way to ask this question, but so what's your take on the lieutenant governor situation?
She's wondering if there's going to be a divorce.
Oh,
Well,
The governor and the lieutenant
certainly
governor.
could not speculate on that, of
No,
course, and it's
no
very
idea.
hard to know exactly what the dynamic of the household was out there at the lieutenant governor's residence and in the vehicles when they were being driven around. We do know the governor asked the inspector general to investigate that. Now, if that investigation is complete, it hasn't been released, and it's not clear whether it will be released at all.
Doesn't have to be, isn't that correct?
I suppose.
Yeah.
Would that be subject to sunshine laws, freedom of information?
I'm not sure. The inspector general is a quasi legal kind of thing, but by that I mean it's sort of nebulous.
It's in that gray area.
In that gray area of where that falls. And we know, of course, that the governor eliminated his state police security detail and reduced his household staff to basically a minimum at the governor's residence. Certainly, it's a fascinating question as to what this portends for the re-election bid of both the governor and the lieutenant governor. It does not seem that the governor has much taste for the lieutenant governor. That is, between what's happened here and a lot of other things, I think that's the sense of certainly the reporters and observers on Capitol Hill here in Harrisburg, that not a lot of love lost, at least from the governor's point of view. And of course, in Pennsylvania, as we know, lieutenant governors are not selected by the governor the way the presidential nominees select a vice presidential, a running mate. They are nominated by voters. But nonetheless, for re-election, you would have expected Wolf and Stack to run together as a ticket, but that's very much, I think, in doubt right now.
Tony Moore and I would like to thank you again for being with us today, and we hope you will be with us again next week on our next show of Behind the Headlines. We'll see you then.